Right. Well, for today, before we even get started with the task, one of the differences today is that we actually start off with an arrow tow, and that's on purpose. If you guys struggle with the tow, don't worry about it. Just hit
User
release
joined
and
your
hit Q,
channel.
and that'll be fine. But I sort of figured that, maybe if some of you guys watched some of the videos that I put up the past week, and maybe if you watched the arrow tow one, that we can put to use some of the things you guys saw there, and if you struggle with it, that's okay. But at the same time, I think it also reinforces that this is an important stage of the flight that we haven't been exploring too much. Of sorts, and today, we're going to be flying on the Wurtsboro Ridge, which is a fun little ridge. It's a bit different than our Blairstown Ridge. It doesn't go quite as far, of course. And actually, once you get cross country, once you get ridge approved, the local ridge approved at Blairstown, you can very easily then head on up to Wurtsboro and fly this ridge, like say in the 134. So it's a nice place to fly. It's a very special little mountain. It's actually not quite the same. No other ridge quite works exactly this way in the way it does, but sections of it do, like little sections. And the principal thing that's different about it is it's a pretty high ridge, but it's pretty flat for the most part, and just some of the way the air works in this local area, it just seems like the air just sort of kind of dips down in the valley, off the plateau in the front, and then it kind of gets bunched back up right along the ridge. It kind of has a nice little harmonic to it. That very often this valley has this kind of really broad rising air that doesn't go up all that fast, but especially in the afternoon when the sun kind of comes around, you get this kind of glorious effect where the wind will, where the ridge just works at like 2,500 feet. You can kind of float along at 60 knots, and there's hardly any turbulence, and the wind's only 10 knots. It's really fun. But the counterpoint to that, though, is when you go and you try to fly this ridge low, it's not a very clear place. So a lot of people that fly this ridge, they tend to really prefer to kind of float along on it, which is perfectly fine. But at the same time, if you learn to fly in this ridge, then you go someplace else, and it's like nothing else is like it, So it's kind of like a little bit of a special little spot. That being said, when you do get to like a flatter spot, like Wet Snyder's, in effect, the ridge starts to act more like this ridge, and so this idea of kind of floating along up higher and in that broader, in that air, that works reasonably well. Oh.
Disconnected there.
So, Brony, I'm not sure what happened to you, but I tried to extend the join time, but there's no chance. And once the join time gets less than 30 seconds, I can't extend it anymore. So sorry about that.
User disconnected from your channel.
Oh, I guess that was it for his day. Bummer.
Gosh.
So Andrew, your best bet is to hit Q.
Okay.
Or I mean, yeah, you can take. You're actually, yeah, even now, just because that way we can get started.
Gotcha.
Doesn't matter.
Trying to do it, but I guess it doesn't work off a toe, so I'll have to.
No, you have to release and then hit Q.
I will do that here in a second.
Yeah, if you guys end up doing the task on your own at some point later or something like that, I definitely take a look at the video that I put up and do practice the tow a little bit and kind of think through kind of the consequences at different times. I think it's a good exercise. Yeah, if you just hit Q, you'll be fine. There you
There
go.
we go. Ah, always into the dive.
All right, guys. So at this point, we can just start heading on over to the start. So in this case, we're kind of floating along at 2,300 feet. The wind here, it's a little bit westerly. The wind direction's about 300, and 300 is about the more or less the optimal direction for here. You know, at Blairstown, we talk about wanting like 330, 340. Here, 300 is pretty good. Once we get closer to Ellenville, which is a little bit further to the north, then the direction starts favoring quite northerly at that point. But when you're near Wurtsboro or a little bit further south, then it works. The other thing is that one of the really nice things about Wurtsboro, and especially once you start flying the local ridge, it's a great idea to head on up here and kind of get checked out and fly the local ridge up here for a little bit, because the great thing is the airport is right at the base of of the ridge, of the northwest ridge, so you can go up on days that are not all that strong and kind of experiment with them with a lot more confidence, because if you start getting a little bit lower, a little bit uncomfortable, well, you just slide right off the ridge. And looking down at this airport, yeah, the other thing is you got the runway. You actually have a couple grass runways. The grass runway that's perpendicular is the best maintained. The other ones are landable, but they're not great, so I wouldn't recommend it. But you can land in perpendicular. I never felt a reason to, personally, but if it's a windy day, it's a very nice option. So that's another thing going for this airport. That said, the tow, just like Blairstown, it can get really, if it's a windy day, it can get pretty wild. So you definitely want to be careful with that. Now, as we're heading along, there's a couple kind of distinct thoughts here. The first is that the area is not all that landable. So the next landing option, which I have not I set out a task today. I didn't, kind of put all the landmarks all around. But if you look at the next kind of big grassy section in the distance, that's where the next fields are. That's going to be one of them is just a field. The other one is the hang glider landing zone, which we'll discuss in a moment. But you have to be very careful heading along into there, because you're between the airport and over there's nowhere to land. That I think it's a lead mine at the base of the ridge, or quarry at least, is oftentimes a place where they'll tow to, and is a pretty good thermal source. I'll pull my brakes out and give you guys a little bit of room. So, and again, kind of going back to what it's like flying a slope, is you want to fly. You're going to want to fly further out. It's very tempting to fly directly over the top of the slope, but the lift gets bunched up in front of the ridge. Upwind of the ridge. Along that big broad slope, but you do not want to be directly over the middle of the mountain, because that just doesn't work so well. Andrew, once we hit the turn point, I'll pull some more brakes and then come down even lower.
Sorry, I'm so far behind here.
You can also hit Q and just kind of charge along and catch up to us. That's perfectly fine too.
There you go. Now I'm above you.
Are any of you guys familiar with Behringer's record flight from the 30s? So the kind of the pioneer of the Blairstown and this kind of the Appalachian Ridge system is Lewin Behringer, and he did a flight from just a little bit further from where we are, all the way down to almost Harrisburg, in a straight-out flight in the 30s, and that was one of the longest flights, and it was done basically along our ridge. So anyway, back to the
User
landing
disconnected
options.
from your channel.
The first viable landing option is basically the second field off our left. There's kind of like the first field has kind of like 2 tree lines in it, and that are cutting across perpendicular across the field. I've actually landed in the field right next to that in a 126, and that works okay. Also, the field to the right of it's kind of a horse demonstration ground, if you can believe that. And then the hang glider landing zone is just to the right of it, is basically right at the base of the ridge, just to my left. You would need to look at the map to get a very clear sense of the proportions in the landing direction. Between this collection of fields, there's going to be something landable. None of them are all that long, so you'd have to be careful if you were like a really big, heavy glider, and you have to definitely be prepared to make a landing there. But that's just about it when it comes to landing options. The next landing option is Ellenville Airport, which is just off our nose, and that's an excellent place to go. Basically, very often, this is kind of the milk run that they do. They go up from Wurtsboro up to Ellenville, and then down to Wurtsboro, maybe a little bit southwest of Wurtsboro, which we will do. But this run with the hang glider landing zone in the middle is kind of what they often like to do. If you guys look out to distance,
Danielle, on my end, you cut out a little bit.
if you look out just off our nose, maybe 1130, that's the Catskills in the distance. The Catskill Mountains. Are you guys copying me okay now?
Yep, you sound great now.
Oh, okay, good. No worries. Yeah, Ellenville is a wonderful place to fly. I have landed there once. Yeah, I think only once. And it's a great place to land. It's got runway lights. On the Wurtsboro does not, which is very nice. But it's no problem. I mean, the airport's like 70 feet wide. But if you did land there, you have to mind the runway lights. Now, once we get up here, now notice that the ridge really flans out. You can actually keep floating along as we are. Very often the turn point is Ellenville, but the ridge can just sort of, there's just good air as you keep going a little bit further. But notice that really, there's not really anywhere you can go on the ridge beyond this point. The valley is very landable ahead of us, but especially on a northwesterly day like today, you get all this bad air that crashes down off the Catskills. So sometimes if you're kind of flying along locally, you can sort of pick up a thermal and kind of glide out a couple miles beyond this point. But it really does, but it's hard to go much further. And also that valley tends to be pretty wet in the summer, so even if you're not flying along on thermals, it's pretty tricky. So, coming back, what we'll do is we'll maybe speed up a little bit and see how that works out. So let's go maybe 100 knots. You wouldn't go this fast necessarily, but we want to see how that would play out. Now, the thing to observe here is, we started at 2,300 feet, and we're going along a downhill ridge. So you'll be able to make a really screaming fast pass heading this way, because even if you're sinking at 1 or 2 knots, you're going to be able, the ridge is going to be sinking faster than you are going. So it's a lot of fun, but it's also something to watch out for. So if you ended up at Ellenville, and the ridge is not all that strong, you can go and screaming along the ridge and get to Wurtsboro, and then if you want to fly back up to Ellenville, then it doesn't work going the other way. That's the kind of the uphill-downhill trap. So that little grassy knoll on the kind of on the top of the hill, I'm pretty sure that's where Behringer launched using a bungee launch system with his Minimoa for that record flight.
What sort of glider was it? What sort of glider was it, Daniel?
It's a Minimoa. So it, I think it was about it's a gull wing, wooden fabric, 18-meter glider designed around thermaling effectively, and it's had the performance. It was in the mid-20s. It was probably pretty commensurate to a 126 at the higher speed. Nice, cool little ship. So yeah, the hang gliders launch right below us right here. They launch off the low hill. Now from this point, you actually have the airport totally made, because you know you're going downhill along this ridge. It's great, you know, and you'd be just totally fine. And this is a nice little section. But notice how different the ridge looks when you're heading one way or the other, and even the places in which you would fly it change from one direction to the other, because you know, when you're going downhill, you can sort of run certain escarpments, but when you're going uphill, then you can't allow yourself to get low in certain spots. But right about here, this is the best section between here and Wurtsboro. Something to watch out for, and kind of going back to the original discussions about kind of the variables that drive ridges, the ridge lift. Take a look at the plateau off our right, and when the wind gets very, very strong, so if you get a day where the wind's blowing 25 knots, the air crashes down behind the plateau, and so the harmonic of that, you know, that lee changes depending upon how strong the sink is. And so if the wind is very, very strong, then what happens is that sink actually lines up pretty much just with the base of this ridge, and it just becomes a violent mess. So now this is very particular for this particular ridge, but this is true for many other places too. So like even our ridge, our local ridge, again, there's not hardly any ever a good reason to go up on a day like this, but let's say the wind is blowing 30 knots from the northwest. Well, we have a little hill that's northwest of our little ridge, and there are times when if the wind gets strong enough, then that lee comes crashing down on the local ridge, and it really doesn't work so well. So you got to pay attention to the upwind obstructions, and in this case, this is a particular feature of how this air sets up. So at this point, notice that we have basically dropped down about 500 feet from when we started out this long, fast glide, and that's perfectly fine. You know, the ridge is working okay, but notice that our height in relation to the ridge really hasn't changed. but yet we lost 500 feet. And so, given the speed at which we were flying, we would not be able to sustain our altitude. Now, that's perfectly fine because we're going 100 knots, but if you did that, say, going 60 knots, and you try to turn around, you would not be able to ride the ridge up. And in this case, that's no problem because you can land at Wurtsboro. But if you are in another section of ridge where you kind of ride out that downhill section, and then you have to be mindful that of your seat crane of your altitude, because if you end up getting lower and lower and lower, then you're going to be out of options once the ridge no longer once the height starts increasing. So at this point, we're approaching the Route 17 gap. So that's Route 17 underneath us. And there's a number of thoughts here. The first is, I recommend for beginners that when they're flying the local ridge in the beginning, to use the Route 17 gap as their southwestern turn point, not go any further. And largely because of the fact that, as you can look ahead, I mean, that ridge really flattens out, gets pretty low, and there's nowhere to land. We're right over a swamp, and people have actually landed in that swamp. It's not pretty. So there are fields off our right. For 126 may be doable for the Cirrus, not doable for certain other gliders, but we're pretty close to the airport. But generally, if you when you decide that you want to venture to Otisville, which is where we're going right now, that it's generally best to just to kind of float your way up, float along at 2,200 feet or so, and allow for the possibility of getting flushed down. But then if you do, then you're going to be running back home to Wurtsboro, and you sort of pre-plan this idea of of maybe doing a abbreviated pattern, landing to the northeast. I believe it's runway. What's it? I think it's it's runway 8. So which is the runway to the northeast. It is possible to run down in the treetops, but it really is not all that comfortable to do that. I mean, I'm pretty sure even Bobby says he doesn't like flying down in the treetops here. Can you guys see the prison on the top of the ridge in the distance? Yep. Does the Otisville prison remotely ring a bell? Does that sound remotely familiar?
Oh, is that Orange is the New Black?
Actually, it might be. I wouldn't be surprised. But the way my little piece of context for that was Michael Cohen, Trump's former attorney, is actually spending his quality time out there. Well, maybe not right now, but that's where they put him.
Definitely not Orange is the New Black, then. I think that's a more less luxurious prison than this one.
I'm not sure that this one's all that luxurious.
It's on the top of a mountain.
Yeah.
It's where all the monasteries usually are.
True. So, once you get to Otisville, even just we're floating along. The ridge is working, but man, you look down. It's like it's really isn't pretty, right? There is a field at the base of Otisville, right at the end of the swamp. It's a very short field. Best for a 126. You can conceivably stuff this kind of glider in there if you were, particularly creative and well prepared to do it. But it really isn't great. There's another slightly better field about 2 or 3 miles away. Again, these kinds of things. I mean, you look at the ridge map, you look at the fields, you can kind of get a sense of them. At some point, maybe we could do another field hopping expedition, with Wurtsboro in mind. And then, if you wanted to say head to Blairstown, you would thermal up out here, and you'd be thermaling for a long way. Because the ridge doesn't work for a long way after this point. Now, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to zip on down to the treetops just to see what this would be like. Largely just
User
to
joined your channel.
have a sense as to, the kind of the sight picture here. And I would even pull my brakes out, and I'm going to slow down to 60 knots, right down at about 1,500 feet. Let's say 1,450. 1,400. In real life, if you're down here, you're not happy one bit. It is doable. There is a ridge. If you get flushed down, your best bet is to hug this ridge and use it to run back home. But often, if you're floating along at say 2,000, 2,200 feet, and then you get just hammered down, you will be able to sort of, on a day like today, kind of meander along at 60 knots or so in fairly turbulent air, and it'll work. And then finally, once you get to like Route 17, then it's going to get better. But oftentimes, this ridge just doesn't work that great. I mean, you even see this in Condor, but, Condor is a little bit more forgiving, because in real life, it'd be a bit more turbulent because you're just in the wash of the plateau in front of you. Do you guys have any questions so far? No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, sorry to get so close to you. It was a network thing.
It's
You
okay.
were pretty far away, and then suddenly you weren't.
Yeah, no worries. Right about here, the ridge tends to get a little bit better. Now, this is where you're starting to, at this point, even though it might not look like it, with some good air along this ridge and you've got the airport made. I'm made on a straight in, not great. But you would be able to make it back to the airport from this point without too much difficulty.
Which highway was this again, Daniel?
Route 17.
17.
I believe they made it now Route 81, but I'm not sure that they've gotten around to completely renaming it. Also, if you look left, you can see where Route 17 kind of cuts through into the plateau, and that gorge often sets up a nice street. So basically, just also kind of another kind of general point about theory, anytime you have these kind of gaps or gorges, the air tends to get funneled into there. Where the air gets funneled into, it speeds up. Where it speeds up, it's like a suction force. I mean, like, think about lift on the top part of the wing, right? The air speeds up, and that creates that sort of suction that makes the lift work. But in the case of gaps and gorges and things like that, that serves to kind of suck in all the bubbles in the area around it, because it's a local wind flow that's basically collecting everything into the gorge. So what happens is there's very often a nice thermal street that sets up right over that, and there's often a pretty good thermal right over where the gap at Route 17 is. It's also why very often you'll get a thermal street downwind of gaps.
Well, it seems to be working today.
Yeah, I mean, in Condor, I'm not quite as, convinced that it would model that directly, but it's definitely modeling the street, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Now, at this point, now we're in really good shape. And from this point, I'd be you could fly down in the treetops from this point on. Again, it doesn't tend to work quite as well as you would expect, given the wind conditions. I mean, we're able to clock along 100 knots and maintain that altitude here, but you're generally not going to be able to do that even on a day like today. It would be closer to like 80 knots. And up high, you might be even able to float along at 60, 70 knots, like 1,000 feet above bridge. but nonetheless, it's still fun to do. Do you guys have any questions so far?
Not me.
This little spot you have to be careful about, particularly in a northerly wind. It's a little bit of sort of have to transition to the high ridge, so it's like blowing like 330 or so. You be careful coming around this little corner. Marks the spot.
Are you carrying any water, Daniel?
No.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out the speed difference in our ships other than mileage.
Maybe take a look. At times, you might be a hair a little bit too far upwind.
Right.
And I'm flying down at 1500.
Yeah, I think just going up there behind you, I was doing 110, still couldn't catch up with you. But...
Yeah, no, if you're a little bit behind, it's hard to catch up because, if you're flying, these gliders, they're supremely inefficient above 80, 90 knots. So if you're flying at 110, you're burning energy real crazy, real fast.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So at this point, now the mountain starts getting higher and higher and higher and higher, and you can still keep zipping along, but notice, in order to get to the steep part of the ridge, you have to stay quite far down on it. And then you find, and actually that actually reminds me, there's kind of like two little ridges here. There's kind of a high ridge and a low ridge, and there's sort of like a little bit of a flat spot in between. You could fly the low ridge, but given that we found that nice strong surge, we went to the higher part. But the hang gliders, they fly the low part.
Is it just because it's easier to handle?
Oh no, it's just because it's steeper. They need to have, they got to have a nice cliff face to launch from. Otherwise, they're gonna be, flying right along the treetops. So at this point, I'd kind of push out a little bit just because I want to give myself a little bit of room. Also, right down at the hang glider launch site, right off our left, that little, that grassy spot right there, right by the road, that's their launch sites. And they have windsocks there, which is very nice. So you get a really nice wind indicator right on top of the ridge. It's right off our left. This is actually one of the, it's a world-renowned hang glider launch site. So they have hosted competitions and all sorts of things out here. It's the hang glider pilots really know Ellenville. So it's a really cool spot. And every once in a while, on a lighter day, they would not be soaring in a day like today because it's just too windy for them. But if the wind is like 10 knots out of the west, west-northwest, you can actually fly with hang gliders with sailplanes. That's a lot of fun.
To you or to them?
I don't know. You should ask them, I suppose. So what's the name of that airport at the base of the ridge? Very good. Just making sure you guys are not totally asleep back there.
Guilty as charged.
User
Yes. Did you notice anyone else?
Fun fact, Mike, the situation Sorrentino of Jersey Shore fame happened to reside there.
Interesting.
I think he got out last year. He was there for a long
Did he do his 20 years in the can?
time. Not quite.
Actually, there's another prison at Wurtsboro, which is where we're turning. Actually, this area, it seems like, I mean, this used to be part of the Borscht Belt, and used to be lots of resorts and things like that. And you can actually see, it's kind of depressing. You can see some of those shuttered down resorts up in the Catskills out here. But it seems like the local economy is very much driven by prisons. And there's the Otisville prison, there's the Wurtsboro prison, there's also a prison up not far from Sullivan County, and I actually had the misfortune of landing in the field that happened to be owned by the prison. and
Oops.
so it was a beautiful field, but I got greeted by a K9 unit in 2 hours.
Is this the one that we're passing just off to our 11 o'clock?
No. It was on a thermal day, about 10 miles northwest.
Okay.
So for the next leg, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go. I'm going to keep going a little bit at the turn point, and I'm going to have you guys lead out, and then we're going to work our way up into the plateau on thermals. And so first we're going to fly the ridge back, of course, and then we're going to climb up and work our way to the plateau. And I'm going to, I'm going to let you guys work the thermals and sort of see what that's like, and see what it's like to go northwest of the airport. So you guys are welcome to turn. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to follow you. So, and kind of the thought here is, well, Wurtsboro, among other things, is what's really nice is, you can actually thermal up and work your way up into the plateau. I mean, you see those beautiful streets, and you can fly 5-10 miles upwind and just sort of work your way upwind and never get out of gliding distance of the airport. And that works very nicely if you're up high. And it's just another one of the nice things you can do to play here. And in general, the Wurtsboro, unlike Blairstown, it is more often soarable. So it's the local valley by Wurtsboro, it's very easy to stay up there. You get a little bit of a westerly flow of any kind, and they're going to get nice thermals off that ridge, and it's a very friendly place to soar. That being said, though, the area where it's very friendly and very easy is pretty small and narrow. So this ridge on a ridge day, from here down to Route 17 down to Otisville is great. You can work 5-10 miles upwind, on those nice little streets, and that's great, but then there's hardly anywhere to land. So it gets really hard to break away from there. It's really hard to break away to the north because that valley tends to be either sinky or it's going to be suppressed by wave, right? Or behind the Catskills. And then, it's kind of tough to head beyond Otisville because, there's no ridge out there, and you're really committed if you're heading into those parts. And so, and then certainly heading, southeast of the ridge, I mean, very often it's there's a lot more traffic. You're not all that far from Hudson. On a northwest day, it's a lot of sink out there. So, the experience that I've had with Wurtsboro is that very often it's kind of a wonderful little playpen where, so to speak. You have this section, kind of this box of sort of 5 miles in either direction, more or less, that is easy to soar in. 10 miles upwind, maybe, certainly you don't want to go downwind on a windy day. But then, but to get outside of that box is really, really tricky. And it's very doable, but it is, once you are, it's very clear to you that you have to make some really big commitments to get outside of that local area. The nice thing about Blairstown is it's not like that. Like you get cross country normal day. You're not really kind of compressed by all the lack of landability or anything like that, to the same degree at least. And same thing with the ridge is that once you want to go cross country, now you can cross the water gap and make go quite a long ways. But it's a very nice place to fly, and it's a very nice, and it's also, I mean, it's a great place to kind of change things up as you're doing your local ridge training. So when you get local ridge approved, and want to go and get some experience flying local ridge before flying cross country, well, you can come out here and do what we're doing. Oh, you guys decided to thermal a little bit earlier. That's okay. Well, in my case, I'm going to go and, kind of put myself well just downwind of the turn point and run up a street. We'll see how that works out. I believe my second strongest thermal was at Ellenville, and I averaged 14 knots for 3,000 feet.
Wow.
And that was in February, in a 126. I actually, when I got home, I looked up the speed of the Empire State Building elevator to see if I went up faster than that. It was just about the same. Right turn, right, left, right, right.
I think it was I saw a left turn at first. Eric, did you see somebody going the other way?
One note about climbing up off this ridge. The lift sets up usually pretty reasonably over the mountain, but if you want to head upwind, pretty much unless you get almost all the way up the cloud base over the ridge, that plateau has a lot of sink behind it, and you're not going to climb up all that well. You're basically charging off upwind into the plateau low is probably not going to, you're not going to find a thermal. In general terms, this is a pretty, it's a wonderful place to fly, but it's also as you can see, it's pretty unforgiving as in terms of the terrain. And so when you fly out here, it really, really does pay to be pretty well prepared, and really understand the terrain. We discussed this in the terms of the ridge, but as we're going to be heading up into the plateau, I very deliberately set the finish at 0 today. And so as you're going to climb up, and I actually, and I recommend to see what it would look like if you, for instance, did not set up your flight computer correctly. Like if you try to do a McCready 0, like a McCready whatever, 4, 5, 6, final glide to 0 over the plateau. And as you're going to go up in there, it's going to be pretty scary. And over the years, there's all sorts of people have gotten themselves into all sorts of trouble out here by, for instance, not doing the kinds of things that we discussed earlier in terms of airport hopping, in terms of knowing these landing options. To my knowledge, there's 3 pilots that I know of in our club that had in the past about 5-7 years have crashed a glider in this area. One pilot ended up coming up short of the airport last year and landed and destroyed a ship in the Coles distribution center. But which was very unfortunate, of course. But again, it's not very landable around the airport. So that what's that? And then another pilot crashed in
User disconnected
an
from your
off-field
channel.
landing on a thermal day. And he basically overshot. It was a short field, and he overshot it on final. Tried to butt hook it at the end, go back the other way and stalled out. Another pilot crashed when he headed northwest of the airport where we're going. Got low, tried to restart an engine, and then it didn't work, and then got too low to make it back. And the reason I bring it up, and it's not so much from the perspective of discussing these accidents or discussing the pilots involved or anything like that. It's just to say that this is a perfectly reasonable and manageable place to fly, but it's not at all forgiving of people making error. It's just any kinds of mistakes you can make. It's going to be much less forgiving of that. Another pilot crashed at the horse farm. Not one of our club members, but again, overshot the field on an off-field landing. One or two pilots I know of have landed in the swamp when they got too low in the area that we talked about and couldn't make it back. And kind of the main theme here is that whereas in another place you might be able to figure out a way, you might just be able, you might find a field to land in. You might, kind of work your way out of a hole. This site does not let you do that. So you have to really treat it with a lot of respect.
User disconnected from your channel.
Does Monticello sound familiar to any of you guys?
Short.
And what for?
Casinos, fast car racing.
Yep.
Some kind of big track up there for that. And of course, a great airport.
It's not quite an airport anymore. It's still possible to land there, but it's really, you have to know exactly what how to deal with that runway. But it's not an airport like it used to be.
The public airport? Or?
No, maybe you're thinking about Sullivan County.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
No, but where we're going is actually is Monticello, right? So, and Monticello is it's a racetrack, and it used to have a straight up runway on it, and it's still landable in one section of it. I wouldn't really recommend treating it that way necessarily. You have to really look at it really up close in order to decide whether you want to actually give that a go. But again, not great. And heading right up along Route 17, I mean, really hardly anywhere to land. I mean, it's so bad that I actually, once when I was flying there in a really cold winter in February, I said, man, this is a really great time to fly out here because all these lakes are landable now, because you can land on the ice. more toward the north, more to the north, there are some little fields in some sections if you really, really know exactly what to look for. But like more closer to Route 17, straight northwest, nothing, absolutely nothing. You guys watch the movie UHF with Weird Al Yankovic?
How old are
I've
you
seen
again?
Good question.
My brother used to like that stuff. So
I've seen him in concert, but I didn't see that movie.
come on, Weird Al is still around.
Oh, yeah.
We like him, us young folks.
I saw him one year that he played the only concert that he did that year down at Celebration, the Star Wars
Cool.
con down in Orlando 2 years ago. It was a great show, 2.5 hours nonstop.
Nice.
Daniel, you usually fly about 5 or 10 knots above best LD when going into wind with the Cirrus.
Well, it's well, there's a number of different thoughts when it comes to speed of fly and the wind.
Sure.
The first thing is completely aside from speed of fly, is when you're going into the wind, your principal concern is flying in good air. So you line yourself up with the street. Basically set yourself up such that you can go straight into the wind in good air. And when you do that, the whole speed of fly aspect changes, completely. I mean, you're not terribly, when you're flying in good air, then you can be flying along at 40 miles an hour in a 126, and so long as you're not descending, I mean, you're still going in a, like if you're going into a 30 mile an hour headwind, well, you're still going 10 miles an hour without sinking.
Right.
Which is not an insignificant feat. So that's kind of I would say that's the first major thought, which is when you're going into the wind, find the energy. Because if you don't, it doesn't matter how fast you're going to go, you're going to fall right out of the sky. And just about near into anything that you're flying. Now, kind of very, very, very basic, simple rules of thumb, such as like in a 126, if you, at minimum, what you want to do is take your wind speed and just add it to your best glide speed, pretty much. So, if nothing else, if you're going to just follow a very simple heuristic. So, in this case, you would want to be going at least 70 knots. Now, there's something to be said that you might want to even go even faster than that, right? And, in my case, I'm going about 80 because I'm punching into the headwind there's thermals around and stuff like that. So, you just fly, set the McCready that you think is appropriate, and you have to back off because when you're thermaling into the wind, your sink rate is high. Is not high. It's you're drifting, back with the wind, so your climb rate, you lose about 1 knot per 10 knots of wind. So a 7 knot thermal, 20 knot headwind is like a 5 knot, and you dive to your speed commander, into your flight computer. If you're, but if you just want a simple, straight up heuristic, if nothing else, just add the wind speed to your best glide speed, like in a 126, And in a glider like this, I mean, 65, 70, 75 knots, I mean, that's when the glider is performing pretty well. And so if you're punching into the wind, you want to be going pretty fast. Does that answer your question?
Makes sense. Thank you.
You are welcome.
I think what I was tending to do is fly a lot slower than I probably should have been, and therefore may have been gaining a little bit of height or keeping that, but losing forward energies, quote unquote. as you say.
Something, I don't think you were here in my last very animated spiel.
Is that
So, which related to with the last time we flew with these guys a couple days ago, which was related to, speed of fly and sink. And the thing to note is, in how many hours have you flown cross country yet?
I haven't really done it in my ship.
Okay.
Lots of airplanes, of course, but yeah, gliders.
Oh yeah,
different
yeah,
story.
yeah. Fair. Okay. So instructors, they usually will tell you there's two speeds to fly. There's best glide speed and minimum sink, right? And minimum sink is for, when you're thermaling, and or you're just trying to float along after when you started a flight, right?
Mhm.
Like on a calm day, which is fine, sure. Then that'll maximize your time aloft. And then if you want to go someplace, you go best glide speed, right? Because that sounds good. Best glide speed, right? It's going to be the best performing part of the glider. However, in the real world, that is often best glide speed is too slow. Oftentimes, if you fly best glide speed between the thermals under pretty much any circumstance, you will reach the next thermal at a lower altitude. You will reach the airport at a lower altitude than if you fly faster. This is extremely important to understand because it's not intuitive to a lot of folks. And the reason for this is because generally we fly on days where the air is convective. And when you're flying on a convective day, there's going to be little columns of rapidly rising air, that's the thermals, and you're going to have wide areas of gently sinking air. Particularly so if it's like a high pressure kind of day, with subsidence. But this is just kind of it's kind of a natural thing, right? I mean, what goes up must come down, and it's actually one of those cruel things because the sink is everywhere, not all that strong, but everywhere, and thermals are very narrow and small, so you have to work pretty hard to find them, right? But it's very easy to find the sink, and when you fly in any sink at all, if you fly in 0.3 of a knot down, if you fly in 1 knot down, it shifts your polar radically because if you fly in a little bit of sink, you're basically if you fly, say in this glider 65, 70 knots, your actual L over D that you're achieving at that given moment is going to be pretty much, it's going to be almost exactly the same as when you're going 55 knots, given that sink. And you have to you have to do the math in order to see that. I can't, I can't just reel off the polar of this glider while we're flying. But, but the key point here is you'll have the same L over D at that given moment, right? So you might be doing, say, 25 to 1, 26, 27 to 1 in the glide, and you're doing the same going 65, 70, or you're doing the same going 50. But the thing is when you're going 50, you're spending more time in the sink, right? So if you're going along and you're trying to get to another thermal, well, if you fly at 25 to 1, but you spend 3 minutes doing that instead of 4, you're going to end up getting there at a higher altitude. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
This is extremely important because a lot of people get this notion that McCready and speed of fly, is related to speed and optimization, right? So you think that, okay, I'm going to go out there and, if there's the guys that want to go and race around a course and those guys are aggressive and risky and they're going cross country and they want to go fast, and that's great. I don't want to do that. I just want to go and float along and I want to take as little risk as possible and stay high and all that sort of thing, which is fine. If that's what you want to do, that's great. But the thing to understand is, that if you actually want to if you want to minimize the energy loss to minimize risk, well, you got to put the glider into a place where it's performing that way. And and a lot of people make the mistake of flying way too slow, and they actually do themselves a lot of harm by doing that. The range of speed in which you can actually choose is very narrow. It's usually like, if you want to go fast, you're going to go, say, 80. There's hardly ever any reason to go any faster, because you go faster, you're just going to get into more, you're going to go right off the end of the polar. And if you want to go, if you want to be conservative, you want to stay high, okay, you go 65. So, and so your range of speed that you can actually choose is actually a very small knob in terms of what you can do to manage things. This is absolutely terrifying. I just dialed in a McCready 7 glide 100 feet over, and I'm at 2,200 feet over the plateau, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to make it over the edge. I did that on purpose because I wanted you guys to see what it's like doing a final glide over this plateau. And it's kind of, and reinforce why understanding how your PDA is set up and how final glides work and how McCready works, things like that, and understanding how to interpret it is really important, because if you just go and blindly follow certain rules, that you can get into really, really, really serious trouble. So, Alan, I think you're about to hit the turn point, right? So, Eric, if you look out at Monticello, you will then see what is the kind of the former and somewhat current runway is on the northwest side of the racetrack.
No joy.
It's used to be a runway, exactly. Now it is still, I think they still allow airplanes to land on it every once in a while, but it's not pretty. Congrats, Eric.
Thanks, and there's a new cloud building right by the turn point, so hopefully it'll work.
How high are you in relation to the airport? So what's your McCready?
241 meters at MC3.
241 below or above?
241 above.
Okay.
Assuming the airport is the next turn point.
Yes, it is. So actually, why don't you try it and see how that would work out?
All right, I will try it.
What
But this cloud is really killer.
I thought my 300 feet over, and I have just barely scraped over the edge of the plateau at 50 knots, and I'm now running through a gorge at minimum energy, and I will make it.
You say you will make it or you will not?
I will.
Well, that thermal behind me was really killer. So if I don't make it, it's your fault. You talked me into this.
Absolutely. No, the point here is not at all to encourage this remotely. I am just pointing out that, like, this is why you should always second guess your PDA. And this is also why this is one of the tricky things about flying up in here is that when you're making a downwind final glide over a plateau, it makes a big difference. And the thing to second guess about your glide computer is, well, if some doofus takes a club ship and sets it up to 0 instead of 1,000 feet over, for example. Not that 1,000 feet is necessarily even sufficient margin for this, but suppose you were okay with that, right? Then now you're scraping along the plateau with what you would thought what otherwise would be a pretty healthy angle, like McCready 70. That's great, right? But in this case, it's going to be hardly enough to get you home. I'm literally running a gully out to get back home.
Yeah, my MC 3.3 in meters is working pretty well.
What racetrack was this again for the fourth
Monticello.
turn point? Monticello, okay.
Thanks, Andrew.
I've been playing with that magic Q key a lot, so
That's okay.
but it's interesting. Yeah.
For these, for what we're doing here, that is perfectly fine. We emphasize that this is a training environment, and the use of having thermal helpers and the Q key actually are wonderful training tools. And so you're under certain circumstances, they actually really they're really good aids to help point things out.
So I made the turn point, and it says I've got about 140 feet for DDH.
At one McCready.
At 4.7.
And what do you think? How would you feel about that under normal circumstances?
Just trying to see where the plateau is, and my nose is shaking around a lot, so I can't use the old rule of thumb of is the height changing in the canopy. But I would say it's feeling a little puckerish. I see that little valley you went through.
But the point here is, like, let's say you put in 1,000 feet margin on your PDA, and you're going to be 1,000 feet higher where you're at. I mean, like at that point you have a pretty healthy, reasonable glide. I mean, 1,500 feet is better, right? But
Hmm.
1,000 feet over, not too bad. If you're 1,000 feet higher than you are, but 1,000 feet lower, it is really, really terrifying. And I mean, like what I just did, I would never ever do in real life. It just, I wanted to kind of show the perils of doing a final glide over the plateau with a tailwind like that.
Hmm.
But, but it just goes to show that if you just blindly follow that PDA, however that's set up, that it can really lead you into really, really, really serious trouble.
Does the Condor PDA actually have a place in the settings that you can set turned altitude at the airport?
You can set your McCready setting, right?
Oh, okay.
You can't set your transfer.
Thank you.
How'd you feel about that final glide?
Well, the thing is, I had a pretty advantageous cloud right after the turn point, so that even though I plowed through it or bumped it, it was no problem. Clearly, I was going to make it. It was never really.
Cool. Feel about skipping along 500 feet above?
Oh no
above the
no!
plateau like
Would I
that?
do that? And for real, no, of course not. But compared to what we've been doing in Condor, it
Oh,
felt great.
sure. No. Congrats, Ellen. Well, I mean, and also one of the things about Condor is that the lift and the sink, it's just a little bit more predictable and reliable. And but when you're on the backside of a plateau like that, along the whole length of the plateau, you're going to have a little bit of sink. So you see, that's one of the things that Condor really doesn't do. Is you can go through stretches where there's a half knot or 1 knot down everywhere for extended areas, and that is extremely. It has a huge impact on your performance. You take a glider like this, and you give it 1 knot of sink everywhere all the time, and you turn it into a 126. And so here, and if you're trying to skim along that plateau and there's a little bit of sink everywhere because that air is so, that plateau is slightly downward facing, right? It's just gonna eat your glide up like you can't believe.
That did happen to me on mine, even though I had that 4.7. I was just playing it out, and there's no way in heck I would have made it.
When you're landing here, normally, the both base legs tend to be pretty violent, just from the downwash off the plateau. Expect to have quite a bit more energy. On the typical pattern here is for if you're landing to the northeast, is a left-hand pattern for runway 8. And sorry, I'm going to land. Now, on a day like today, that really doesn't work so well, right? because you'd have to be plowing through all that sink to get to the plateau, and then you're going to be making your pattern crabbing into the sink into the plateau, and then you're arcing back to the coals and the distribution center and landing. It's just a big mess. So I much prefer to make my pattern over the ridge. And so if I'm making a left-hand pattern, I mean, on a typical day, you'd be making your landing pattern maybe a little bit lower, maybe a little bit closer to the airport, kind of halfway between the ridge and the airport. But on a ridge day, I find that the best way to do it is to pull some brakes and skim along the ridge, above ridge top. That way, you don't have to worry about hitting the mountain, right? I mean, you're in the ridge lift with your brakes, open. And then, you kind of line yourself up on a high, nice base and just plow through the headwind in the sink with maintaining a lot of energy and speed, and then turn final and land. And I do this in either direction. So I make my approach off the ridge